One morning, without any warning, the world your ancestors knew began to die. Not in a single dramatic moment, not with a sound or a flash or a sign that something enormous was changing. It happened the way the most dangerous things always happen, slowly, then all at once. The winters grew longer. The summers stopped arriving on time. The animals your ancestors depended on began moving in directions they had never moved before. The plants that had fed your ancestors for generations retreated, then disappeared entirely. And your ancestors, without science, without satellites, without any framework to understand what was happening to their world, had to survive it anyway. They did. And the way they did it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of your species. Here is what was actually happening. Roughly 26,000 years ago, the Earth entered what geologists call the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. Ice sheets nearly 3 kilometers thick covered what is now Canada, Northern Europe, and large portions of Asia. Global temperatures dropped by an average of 6 degrees Celsius. Sea levels fell by more than 120 meters as enormous volumes of water locked into ice. Entire landscapes that had supported human life for thousands of years became uninhabitable within the span of a few generations. A few generations. That is the part that matters, because your ancestor did not live long enough to watch the full transformation. They watched a piece of it. They noticed that piece, and they made decisions based on what they noticed that kept their children alive long enough to notice the next piece. Paleoclimatologist Eska Villerslev at the University of Cambridge has spent years extracting ancient DNA from permafrost and sediment layers to reconstruct what human populations actually did during these climate shifts. His findings are striking. Human groups did not wait for the ice to arrive. Long before the glaciers reached their territory, populations were already moving, changing, adapting. The signal was in the animals first, in the migration patterns, in the seasonal behaviors that shifted subtly year by year. And your ancestors were reading those signals with a precision that no instrument has yet fully replicated. They were the instruments. Think about what your ancestor actually knew. They knew every animal in their territory the way you know the people in your household. They knew which direction the elk moved in early autumn and which direction in late spring. They knew which berries appeared after which rains. They knew the sound the wind made coming off the northern ridge versus the southern one. They had accumulated, across hundreds of generations of careful observation, a living atlas of their environment so detailed that a single deviation, a bird species arriving 2 weeks early, a river running lower than it should in midsummer, registered as significant. That was their early warning system. Not technology, attention. Archaeologist Clive Finlayson at the Gibraltar Museum has documented how different human groups responded to the Ice Age with dramatically different strategies. Some groups moved south, following the retreating warmth along coastlines and river valleys. Others moved to higher elevations, where microclimates preserved pockets of livable terrain. Some did something that still surprises researchers. They stayed. They dug in. They adapted their diet, their tools, their shelter, and their social structures to survive conditions that should, by any reasonable calculation, have killed them. The ones who stayed invented things. Needle and thread appears in the archaeological record during this period, not as a coincidence, but as a direct response to cold. Sewn, fitted clothing made from animal hides represented a revolution in thermal regulation that allowed humans to inhabit latitudes no primate had ever survived. Cave paintings from this same era, the extraordinary galleries of Lascaux, of Altamira, of Chauvet, are not decorations. Researchers, including archaeologist David Lewis Williams, have argued they are repositories of knowledge, maps of animal behavior, records of migration routes, visual libraries maintained across generations so that the next group, and the group after that, would know what their ancestors had learned about survival in a world that kept changing. They were writing things down. They just wrote in images, on stone, in the deepest chambers of the earth, where the images would last. But perhaps the most important adaptation was one that left no physical trace in the archaeological record at all. They changed who they talked to. Genetic evidence compiled by population geneticist Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute shows that during the Ice Age, human groups that had been largely isolated began exchanging people, and therefore knowledge, at unprecedented rates. A group that had mastered cold weather hunting techniques merged its knowledge with a group that had mastered coastal fishing. A group that knew how to construct semi-permanent shelters shared that knowledge with a group that had been nomadic for thousands of years. The networks expanded precisely when they were needed most. Your ancestor did not survive the Ice Age alone. No individual did. No single group did. The survival of your species during the coldest period in recent geological history was a collective project. A vast, slow, largely invisible collaboration conducted across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of generations, held together not by institutions or governments or technology, but by the oldest human infrastructure there is: story, memory. The knowledge passed from one hand to another around a fire that someone had worked very hard to keep burning. There is a moment that archaeologists have reconstructed from a site in southern France, dated to approximately 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last glacial maximum. A small group, perhaps 15 to 20 individuals, sheltered in a limestone overhang. Outside, temperatures regularly dropped below -20. The megafauna they had hunted for generations were gone, pushed south by the ice. The plant foods they had relied on had vanished entirely. And yet, in the debris layer of that shelter, researchers found the bones of Arctic fox, of ptarmigan, of fish from a river several kilometers away. They found evidence of plant material processed and stored. They found pigment, suggesting they were still making images even then, still recording, still transmitting, still insisting that what they knew mattered and should not be lost. They did not give up. They did not collapse into chaos. They looked at a world that had become almost unrecognizable, and they got creative. That is what your species does. That is what you come from. One morning, without any warning, the world your ancestors knew began to die, and they built a new one with their hands in the cold,